Thanks, Brad. All right, thanks for coming, everybody. This talk is about the critically endangered Western gray whale, not the Eastern one, despite all of the confirmations as to otherwise that I gave to Brad and Amy over the last couple months. You'll learn the distinction in just a second here. Yeah, so it's the Western gray whale. Okay, so this is a story about the crashing together of humans and whales. And so what I'd like to do is just take a step back and talk a little bit first about thinking about how humans interact with the marine environment and the critters that live there. So if you've taken marine mammal biology with me, you've seen this slide before. I'd like to just start with this cartoon here that I think does a pretty good job of getting folks to think about kind of the way that humans tend to see the earth and the resources that are available from this earth is kind of, we sort of feel ownership of them and entitled to them, despite the fact that we do share this place and these resources with a lot of other critters. So just an example of that guy yelling at that dolphin for taking a fish. But this is just to say that there is some overcrowding happening, and that this is, and when we talk about the marine environment in relation to human use of the marine resources available there. So there's a lot that I could have put up here, so I'm just going to put some things up here. Humans use the marine environment for oil and gas, and that's going to be featured a lot today in the talk about the Western gray whale. Science, so lots of reasons why scientists are out there exploring the oceans. National security, so you're thinking military exercises and things like that. Commercial shipping, commercial fishing, sport fishing, ecotourism. So people like to look at the charismatic wildlife that's out there themselves, as well as just other forms of recreation, you know, whatever people like to do, cruise ships and recreational vehicles and things like that, enjoying the ocean. And then more recently, there are issues to do with acidification. Pollution is a huge deal. There's so many different types of pollution that end up in the oceans. Plastics is a huge one, single-use plastics in particular, runoff from agriculture, just from the land, right? So so many different things. And then more recently, climate change. So folks that do research in the field that I'm in, when we think about climate change and pollution, we think about what we call regime shifts, which are massive changes in the makeup of the communities in these oceans. So who's there, how many there are, quality and quantity of prey available, for example, to certain types of consumers. So this is huge and something that's happening right now. And so gauging my audience here, I put a couple slides in here that I may have skipped past if it was just me and Brad and Amy today, because if you're on the Sustainability Council, you're well aware of this, that the reason why you're probably wondering why not just make people stop doing all of this stuff, or maybe start doing less of it, is because we're talking about humans and wildlife coming together. So we're talking about wildlife management. And it's a very complicated topic. Wildlife management, by its definition, involves human priorities and goals. And just a quick thought experiment here of different factors that will feed into that are different attitudes about wildlife. So for example, when you see that deer up there, right, do you see a beautiful being that deserves a life free from pain and as natural a life as possible? Or do you see a trophy, right? Do you see a food resource? Like, what do you see when you see that deer? Yeah. Okay. When you see that coyote, same thing. Do you see a threat to livestock, right? Do you see a disease carrier? Like, what do you see? And then the ducks, right? Are they food or are they ducks? So just different attitudes about wildlife. Culture is going to play a big part in those attitudes about wildlife. Economics, right? Something that is worth a lot of money might seem more like a resource than inherently worth existing just for its own sake, and vice versa. When we're talking about people, we're talking about laws. These are human constructs here, and that's going to involve politics, and we know how dicey that can get. And then if you pull away from all the human stuff, there's just the actual biology of the animals themselves and the systems that you're interested in, which oftentimes we don't know a lot about. Okay, so just to get you thinking about why the story that I'm going to tell you about whales and humans is as complicated as it is. Okay, another thing I want to put on your radar, if you don't think about this stuff, is it's only in very recent times, like in the last couple of generations, that people have started seeing animals as more than just resources available for us to harvest and use for whatever purposes we would like. The idea of them as competition for resources or barriers to those things has typically been more the case. But more recently, these ideas that animals have feelings, that they feel pain, that they deserve humane treatment and rights and things like that, that's all very new. That's all in the last couple of generations. Of course, there are previous generations where there were individuals who also felt those things, but just taking it for granted today that is very commonplace, and that has not been the case for most of human history. Okay, one last slide about wildlife management. Okay, so here's just one example before I get the whale story. Here are these reindeer in Russia, and those little circles are in that infographic there are showing you what we call different stakeholder groups, meaning different groups of people that see that exact same species in that same area different as far as what value that species has and what uses it has and things like that. And it's these stakeholders that make things complicated. So when I was getting my master's, I wanted to save the world. I got it in coastal environmental management, and I thought I'm gonna learn all about how humans and the coastal environment interact, and I'm gonna go make a difference. And naively, I learned that it was much more complicated because different stakeholders, different groups of people feel very strongly and differently about the exact same human wildlife issues. And this is just because they have different values. And as we've seen in the news today with any hot button topic you can think of, in most cases, everyone feels like it's their own values that are the right ones and that everyone else is at a minimum misguided, right? And at worst, they're actually malicious. And this is especially the case when money is involved or practices that are tied into cultures or generations of like some family way of existing or doing things, right? So all of those tied together. And this makes it very difficult for lawmakers to make decisions about conservation and wildlife, right? Because no matter what decision they make, there's someone who's pissed off, right? There's someone who's unhappy, or lots of groups are unhappy. Someone's going to be upset. I once saw a man in a room throw a folded chair in a room full of people in a public hearing that the National Marine Fisheries Service was holding, trying to help manage this fishery that was collapsing. And one of the fishermen got up and literally threw a chair across the room in this public hearing because he was so upset by the proposed measures on the table that we were discussing, because we were threatening his livelihood as well as a generation, a livelihood that had been in his family for generations. So he was like, oh, the conservation biologists don't know what they're talking about, and the sports fishermen. And so people get really upset about it. Okay, let's circle back to this. One other way that humans impact the marine environment that I don't have listed up here that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about moving forward is noise pollution or anthropogenic or human-caused sounds in the ocean. So things that normally aren't there. So just really quickly, the oceans already are pretty noisy naturally. There's earthquakes and random, sometimes underwater volcanic eruptions and climatic events and stuff like that. And also the critters that live there can be quite chatty and noisy and talking to each other and whatever. So it's already noisy, but I would posit that today it's much noisier in ways that are very different from anything these animals have evolved to deal with and experience in the last tens of millions of years of their existence. And so again, just like the slide here, there are a lot of examples that I could have put here, but I just picked out a few. I'm going to play a couple of sounds for you. Some of them are embedded right in the slide, and hopefully they will just elegantly play when I get play. We'll see. And then these last two, I actually have linked out onto a website, so I might toggle back and forth and be awkward over Zoom, so just bear with me. I'm also not sure how the volume is going to impact people. So here we go. So here's a super tanker. So this is something that would be carrying lots of cargo right across the oceans, maybe oil, super tankers, things like that. Let's see. Here's something that you might hear underwater. We struggle with this.
Super tanker.
Okay, so that's not something that they've probably evolved to deal with, right? And there's a lot, that's one, right? There's lots of these. Here is an outboard engine, just a small little zodiac here. And you can actually, if you listen really closely, you can hear whales singing in the background. So you can hear how their song is masked a bit by the engine noise.
Super tanker. Super tanker.
I'm gonna try it one more time. I don't know why this is so hard for me. You hear the sweet sound of the whale. I'm gonna spare you guys the other sounds in my technical inaptitude, but so whales, which we're gonna get to now, they rely on sound a lot when they're navigating, when they're talking to each other, when they're avoiding predators, things like that. So this is an issue in particular for animals that rely a lot on acoustics in the water, just dealing with. What I'm not going to play for you are these dredging vessels. This is something that like maybe the Army Corps of Engineers would use, for example. It's something really common they'll do. They'll dredge up sand like along the coastline and just move it to a different location, just depending on what people want them to do with it. Tidal turbines, they're what they sound like. They are like wind turbines, but they just harness power from like the wave energy underwater instead of air, right? So and that's just like, you know, one of 100 things I could. Okay, so now we're into the whales. Okay, so for some time, right, people have known that baleen whales, right, so large whales with the baleen plates, and they filter little critters out of the water for food, that they respond to underwater sounds. And so, for example, here's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the author of the Sherlock Holmes series. And long before he created that series, he actually went on an expedition to the Arctic, and he, with whalers, and he noticed that the whales there were reacting to the sounds from the boats, but not to the natural sounds in the environment, like the bumpy, or the noisy sounds of like ice floes bumping together. So he noticed that they had a reaction. And then even farther back than that, there were folks, these whalers back as far as the 1600s, that noticed that, again, these whales were able to distinguish between natural sounds and human-made sounds, even at equal loudness, if you will. And that they reacted differently, meaning they didn't react at all to natural stuff. Okay, so the knowledge that whales respond to sound is nothing new, and it's also just a starting point. There's a far more important question, though, which is when are whales impacted by these different kinds of sounds and what kinds of situations. This distinction is actually really important because whether a whale moves away from a sound source and is unharmed is very different than if you actually impact, for example, their ability to feed in a really productive area, right? So there's context in that matter, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so are you going to cause a whale to move away from its food source? Are you going to cause a whale to move away from mates? And sometimes this happens, are you going to cause a whale to move away from its offspring, right? So these are all things that we would consider bad responses. Okay, so let me tell you now about what this is like to study and ask these questions from the perspective of a biologist, right? So this question imposes massive challenges. So first, you have to understand the sound itself, right? So not all sounds are created equally. So if you want to understand how it's impacting the whale's behavior, you have to understand, so I have some examples here. Is the sound impulsive or is it continuous, right? Is it pulsy, like in this on-off way, or is it a continuous source, right? Is it directional or is it more dispersed, the sound that they're experiencing? Does it rise suddenly and without warning, or is it something that's predictable and is, you know, something that they can anticipate? And what are the frequencies that make up that sound? Because whales are very particular about the frequencies of sound at which they're most sensitive. Okay, next, how does that sound travel through the water? So you guys may or may not know a lot about how sound moves through the air or through the water, but it's different. You ever gone underwater and tried to localize a sound and point it in the wrong direction? Try it sometime with a friend, cover your eyes, have a knock on the side of the pool and point to the sound and you'll be pointing in the wrong direction. Sound moves differently in water than in air. Depends on the depth, it depends on the temperature, the salinity, depends on the bottom topography, all kinds of things change how sound. So you add to this the complexities of what's already there, right? Is this already an inherently noisy place, right? Is there lots of turbulence already from oceanographic conditions, right? Or is it a really calm nursery area for calves, for example? So all that is going to come into play. Okay, last thing, if you're a biologist, how do you tell what a whale can hear, right? Like, what can this animal hear at what frequencies, and what are the thresholds of volume at which they can hear at those frequencies? And more importantly, what frequencies are bothersome or even harmful, right? This is super easy to do with a human, right? You have controlled conditions, you put them in a soundproof room and you play some sounds and you say, tell me when you hear stuff, right? And how do you feel about it? And you can't do that with a wild whale. Okay, so this is the challenge that we face when we are asking these questions. So here's how we do this. First thing we need to do is we need to associate a change in behavior with a received sound. So here is my friend and good buddy Ari Friedlander putting an acoustic tag on, that's a humpback whale. I don't remember what that guy is right there, but it's these little suction cup tags, and they go unnoticed by the whale because the whales are massive, and they pop off of the whale anywhere from 2 hours to, like, if you're really lucky, you might get 24 hours worth of data before the tag pops off. Then you got to go find it and scoop it up. And you can program the tag to record whatever types of data you're interested in. In this case, acoustic tags, so you can record ambient sounds, you can record sounds that the whales are making, and more importantly, you can do playback experiments where you expose them to sounds experimentally and see how they respond. So you can also record that. I'll show you some examples of other types of data that you can record about the animal's behavior as well from these tags. Okay, but some questions of interest, do they change direction when you play a sound? Do they change their diving behavior? Do they change their own acoustic behaviors, right? Do they stop calling as much and things like that? There's lots of things. This is incredibly logistically difficult. Just as a little aside, that whale is going to be at the surface for about 2 seconds, catching a breath, and then it's going to disappear for upwards of 15 minutes or more. And you're just looking out the open ocean, hoping that you will happen to be riding alongside that whale when it pops to the surface. And then you've got Ari, who's amazing at this for some reason, like just getting that tech, you got one shot at it, and then that whale disappears. So sample sizes are pretty small for that reason. Okay, so now here's an example of what you might do, right? So over here is just a little schematic of it, but over here is kind of just some pictures of what this might look like. Some researchers with a little hydrophone in the water, where the hydrophone works in both directions. It picks up sounds as well as can emit sounds. And then you can emit sounds at different, whatever experimental treatments you're interested in, different levels of noise, for example. And then you just try to ride somewhere nearby the focal animals that are wearing your tag of interest and see how their behavior changes when you expose them to these different types of playback experiments. Okay, so that's just one example. The next slide is a little sciencey, and so don't worry too much about it if this isn't your way of thinking about the world. Here's just some examples of the types of information that you can get from these tags when you expose animals to these playback experiments. So over here in the upper left, what's shown for you on the left side, in that left column, is what the animals are doing before exposure to, in this case, these animals are northern bottlenose whales, these guys up here, and they are being exposed to mid-frequency sonar, which simulates what the military does, the US military does when they're practicing in the same area. This is near Bermuda. So on the left here is activity on the top, just who's there. So warmer, brighter colors means there's more animals there. And the bottom is their acoustic activity, right? So more colorful, they're talking a lot. And then on the right is after exposure to those mid-frequency sonar. So you can see there's just not as many individuals or any. And then down here, you can see they're just, they're vocalizing less. So they're quiet, and they're also avoiding the area. And then down here, another way, these are all different changes in behaviors in these box plots before and after exposure. It doesn't really matter if you want to read these papers, you're certainly welcome to, right? But something that's interesting is just seeing how their dives change. So over there on the left is a whole bunch of dives before exposure, and so that would maybe represent what's typical. And then over here on the right is after they're exposed to sonar, and you can just see, for example, with that orangish line, that the animal changes its behavior and dives much deeper. This is 22,000 to 2,500 meters, right? So we're talking like a mile down into the ocean here. And also just spending more time, and then spending a lot of time coming up. indicating putatively that this animal is engaged in some sort of avoidance or evasive behavior, right, after exposure to sonar. Same thing over here, it's just changing its behavior. It's moving along on some course and it changes its direction after it's exposed to that source. So those are just the different types of behavioral information that you can pull off of these instruments, use a lot of math and coding software and get pretty pictures like this and try to say something about behavior. Okay. But then the question is, if an animal does that, for example, or does that, given that whales typically are long distance migrators, does it matter, right? Is the animal suffering if it's moved off of its intended path by a couple of kilometers? Okay, so let's see here. So this is the big question as we get specifically to our gray whales is from the perspective of conservation, right? A biologically meaningful anthropogenic disturbance, in this case, sound exposure, is one that causes a change in behavior to the individual that is sufficiently maladaptive that it impacts her reproductive success, right? So, and we're specifically talking about reproductive females because they are the ones that limit population growth. So, harm to individuals is definitely of interest, but what's more of interest is keeping population stable and not in decline. So it's really all about the reproductive females. Okay. All right. So, oh, and by the way, this is a Western gray whale mom with her calf. Very cute. Okay. So I'm just back up a little bit. I'm going to get into the gray whale now, but before I get into what's happening now, I just need to let you know how we got here. So just a little bit about, oh, sorry, trigger warning. There is a sad picture on this next slide. I should have warned you guys. So if you don't like seeing dead whales, I'm really sorry. How did we get to where we are today? So I want to talk to you just a little bit about the whaling legacy and specifically the industrialized or modern whaling era. So up here in the upper right is sort of this like artistic rendering of like what whaling was like back in the day when people did it from sailing ships and using human power or wind power at maximum, right? And so folks back in the day were really limited by the capacity of the ship to process and hold whale meats and other products from that whale and preserve it before they got back to shore and it was all spoiled, right? So that put a limit on how much, if you want to think of whales as a resource, how much of that resource we could extract from the oceans. However, right around to the early 1900s or so is when we saw the advent of what we now today call factory ships, where they were like super tankers that were factories, and they still exist today. Iceland and Japan, for example, still do this. But instead of throwing your harpoon or whatever at a whale, now you had gunpowder and you had these harpoons from ships, right? So you could hit whales at much longer distances. You could drag them back to the boat. You don't have to worry about losing your whale. And you could process large numbers of animals indiscriminately. And there was freezers, and then you'd be really close to some shore-based factory that would handle all of this product. This graphic on the left here is just showing you in a general sense. On the top are large whales like blue whales and fin whales and humpback whales and things like that. Over time, the harvest. And then down here is the same time frame. Sorry, this got cut off a little bit, the time frame, but it's the same one for when folks switched to harvesting smaller species. Gray whales are kind of like right at that cutoff between a large and a small whale. What you'll see is a couple of things. Number one, you'll notice that right around the advent of factory ships, right, you see a huge increase in the amount of whaling. And then there was a drop around World War II, and then you see it resumes afterwards. And then also what you see is really typical of people when they over harvest a resource is they'll switch from the largest thing to the next largest thing to the next largest thing. So you see a switch from large whales into harvesting of smaller whales as they over harvested to near extinction large whales. And this is the legacy that we're dealing with today, which is right around 1985, the International Whaling Commission established a worldwide moratorium or complete cessation of whaling that most countries adopted, except for a few, because there's no way to police this, right? We're talking international waters outside of anyone's economic zone, so there's no way to enforce it. Most countries that we're doing this kind of stuff. Okay. Okay, that's all I want to say about that. So here's the gray whale. So most baleen whales were hunted to near extinction during all of the whaling era until 1985, which is why everyone's like, we got to stop. And that is where most species are still today. They're in some degree of recovery, but they're still not anywhere near their historic numbers before whaling. So here's our gray whale. This is our focal species for this ongoing conservation story that I'll be telling you about for the next 20 minutes or so. Just like all whales, the gray whale has what we call a slow life history, meaning that it takes a couple of years for one adult female to go through a pregnancy and lactation or nursing of one calf, successfully wean that calf. It's about 2 years, and then maybe she'll take a break for a year and then she'll get pregnant again. So it's more like a 3 years. Okay, so slow life history. And just to give you a sense of scale, so they are quite large, obviously, but relative to other baleen whales, like I said, they're kind of medium in size. So just to give you a sense of perspective, this is a blue whale here. Blue whale is the largest, not just whale, but the largest animal that has ever existed on planet Earth. So we are so lucky that we coexist with the largest animal that has ever existed, bigger than any dinosaur. That is half of the animal. Right? The other half of the animal keeps going that way. And that's about the size of a gray whale right there. So basically what you can see. So if you pull away a little bit, that's the whole blue whale right there. That's an 80 footer. They can grow up to about 90 feet. Okay. So also they have a heart that's the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And the major blood vessel leaving their heart, their aorta, is large enough that theoretically a human could swim through one and not touch the side. Yeah, pretty cool. All right, so going back to the gray whale, I'm just a nerd about marine mammals, so. Okay, so they are really unique amongst baleen whales in this feeding style that they have. So what they do is that we call them muckers, because what they like to do is they go along the bottom sediment, which I'm going to call the benthic, benthos. So if I say benthic, I mean bottom sediment. Sandy, muddy bottoms, and they flip over to one side and they open their mouths and they just drag their baleen plates through the bottom sediment. And they use suction feeding to suck up a whole bunch of sand and mud and water. And then when they rise up, they use their tongue to push that water out over their baleen plates, which act as little filters like combs, and all little critters get stuck behind. And so let's see if this video is working. But that's an example of one of their primary prey items. So they'll eat anything basically that they gather from the bottom, clams and other bivalves like that, isopods, polychaete worms, whatever. But amphipods, they're a type of crustaceans like little shrimps. They can be quite big though. These guys can get, you know, the size of a lobster, but the ones these guys forage on are like quite a bit smaller, maybe the size of my pinky or even my fingernail. They can be just depending on their life stage. Okay, we call these guys ecosystem engineers because they change the physical structure of the ecosystems they're in. Okay, so let's see if this is working. I'm not going to watch the whole thing, but you can just see an example of a baleen plate. As an advertisement for some kind of whale watching or something. Okay, so just a little bit more about the gray whale now. So as I mentioned, they are long distance migrators, and there is some claim that they are the longest migrating mammal known. Recently, there was some record flocks, but I'm not sure if that's still the case. But you can see here, this in a general sense, this is the North Pacific Ocean that you guys are familiar with, North America and that whole continent over there. And over here would be like, you know, Russia, China. Here's Japan right here. Oh, wait, you guys can see my pointer at all. Here's Japan right there. Okay, just to give you a sense of where we are. And what they like to do in a general sense is go to one area for breeding and another area for feeding, right? Because the oceanographic conditions are very different there. One promotes production, lots of stuff to eat, and the other one's like calm and warm and really good for babies, right? So they'll travel these massive distances across ocean basins to do this, and this is typical of baleen whale. What you see here in the two different colors is this controversial distinction between what this graphic here is calling two different populations, but what a lot of biologists will actually argue are two different subspecies. And that distinction is really important for management because policy depends on who you believe is endangered or critically endangered, and whether you think that's part of a larger group or whether you think they really are distinct groups. So that distinction about whether you're a population or a species really matters for management. But you can see in the darker blue, that is the eastern gray whale that I will not be talking about today. And then the lighter blue is the western gray whale that I will be talking about. Okay, so just really quickly, the eastern, the one that I'm not talking about. This one should maybe be more familiar to you because these guys, you can find them right off the west coast of the United States and Mexico and up through Alaska. You can go to their nursery grounds off of Baja, in fact, and the moms will bring their calves up to you in the boat to let you pet them, and they'll like drop them off. You feel like they're letting you babysit them for like they get a break or something, right? So they're pretty awesome. They're really social and really curious creatures. And they are considered a conservation success story. They rebounded fast after the moratorium on whaling, and their population grew to about almost 30,000 individuals until about 4 years ago. There was an unusual mass mortality event that is still occurring today. If you look in the news, there are gray whales washing up along the western seaboard, emaciated, and they're dead. So we think it has to do with, again, this climatic ocean regime shift that they're starving, basically. At least there's no smoking gun, but that seems to be where most biologists are. So there's a lot of conservation groups and biologists, trigger, but there's a lot of conservationists and biologists that are raising alarms right now, like alarm bells, but the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is the US governmental agency that is responsible for managing this species, is still touting this as a success story, even though their population has dropped down to 17,000 from, to over 25,000 in just the last 4 years. So it's happening really fast. So pay attention to that. Okay, this is the species that I was involved with for my research, which was the western gray whale. So this was a species that was actually thought to be extinct due to over harvesting until the 1970s, when there was a remnant population discovered, and it had maybe about 100 individuals, we're not sure, and maybe at most a couple dozen reproductive females. Okay, so that was really fun. They were discovered off the coast of Sakhalin Island. So where the heck is that? That is here. So if you look over here, Russia, right, Japan, right here, the Sea of Okhotsk, which I never know how to say that right there. Sakhalin Island is that little island that I have circled right there. And that is a nursery ground for the western gray whale. That's where they bring their calves so that they can feed while their calves are safe. Okay, so now we're getting into some politics because we're involving lots of countries with stakes in this area. And now we're starting to crash together the human and the whale part of the story. So basically, the specific part of the human story that is going to crash into this critically endangered species is big oil. So I just took this out of this article here where there were conservation groups and scientists that were urging Russia to halt their oil surveys in this region, but that's really difficult to convince anyone to do because it's estimated there are 45 billion barrels of crude oil just right there off that island. And so it's considered right now the world's most promising frontiers for oil exploration. This is from Shell and ExxonMobil, right? This is their statement. And so despite the island's frigid weather and rough seas, new fields continue to come online. This is still true. And then this is just that conservation group that wrote this paper just urging these folks to consider the tenuousness of this rare group of animals. And so now we're getting conservation groups involved. So as early as the mid 90s or so, you started seeing small, like just the public, right? People living in these areas, not super into these whales being harmed. And then you started seeing big conservation groups getting involved. So this is the IUCN, WWF, International Fund for Animal Welfare, so big conservation groups getting involved. However, now they're fighting with, we've got, like I said, lots of different these are big players, right? We're talking Putin, we're talking Xi Jinping, thank you, planes. I almost went North Korea there for a second. So we're talking big players, right? That we already don't talk to very well and who don't talk to each other very well necessarily, right? Okay, and then, so what are they interested in? Well, they, along with Japan, are interested in resource extraction in this area, in addition to things like militarily just kind of, having control of that area. So things like fish are really important to Japan, and then oil. Oil is the big one. So when I say oil, Russia has two big oil companies called Gazprom and Rosneft. Those are the two big ones. And we have Shell and ExxonMobil who are also involved. Shell and ExxonMobil, together with a couple of these companies and Mitsubishi and some companies in India, they have created this international conglomerate called the Sakhalin Energy Investment Company. They're the ones that paid for my graduate research work, for the research that I just recently finally published. Okay, Rosneft is the one that we fight with because Rosneft is the one that won't get on board. So you can see this is their landing page as of yesterday. They are not really shy about the fact that they're not embarrassed they do what they do in areas that are maybe sensitive for some critters and in pristine locations, right? So very difficult. Okay. Gotcha. All right, so now I'm gonna get to the paper that I just published. So with all that by way of background, I have to introduce you to this man. This is Dr. Roger Melton. He just recently passed away from cancer. But he was an exceptional man. He has a PhD or had a PhD in chemical engineering. He was the chief scientist at ExxonMobil for decades. And when it became clear to him that his employer was interested in developing in this area where these whales, that seemed pretty critical to these whales, he got involved. What he did was he started organizing these different groups to talk to each other, right? And this is a very difficult job he had because he's thinking ExxonMobil cares about their bottom line, right? They care about profits. And then he's got these he's trying to talk to Russian scientists and non-Russian scientists, right? And get them to talk to each other. So I was one of those non-Russian scientists. So he was not a marine mammal biologist, but he read voraciously. He read everything he could about marine mammals, about behavioral ecology, about oceanography, because he really wanted this to be done right. And this is because if you look here, right, this is literally a map of the oil drilling platforms. You can see the hatched areas are the specific areas where they drill for oil. The platforms themselves are the little squares. And then these blue polygons here, that's the inshore one, and the offshore one, this is where gray whales forage. This is their prime foraging habitat when it's there. So he was very concerned about this. And then there was a lot of research that came out that said, oh, the whales are fine, they're not being impacted. And he was the one that took 15 years to get groups together and get them working together with each other. So here is members of the joint Russia-US Western Gray Whale Research Program, right, working off there. I wasn't lucky enough to be able to go there and do that. Okay. So then this is right when I was doing my PhD, I got involved in this work, right? Just because of the nature of what I was doing in the wet lab, I was the one who could do the part that I did. And so then there was like groups that were getting really excited about this, saying, oh, finally whales and scientists and big oil are teaming up. You know, this is great. And conservation groups like the IUCN were really excited about this. And then it took us until October of 2022, so a few months ago, to finally publish the work that we had been doing since when Roger came to us in UC Santa Cruz and asked us to do our part in this work. That was like 2014, 15-ish, and then I started my job here. I was interviewing, and then I started my job here, and then Roger passed away right as all of this was, we started writing these papers. So what we did is we dedicated this special issue of environmental monitoring and environmental monitoring and assessment to all of the research that had been done in the last now 20 years on the whales there, their behavior, their prey resources available, the oceanography, how they respond to sonar, all this, the air guns and things like that. So this finally just got published, which is really, and there's my paper. It's not a very important paper. But the big takeaways from this collection of papers was that number one, gray whale moms can only afford to lose a very small amount of energy before they will abort their calf or abandon their calf. In fact, 3% of the energy that they normally get is enough for them to have a failed reproductive event. So that was learned. Number two, we discovered the biggest aggregation of amphipods ever in that offshore site, right? So you're like, big deal. If you disturb them in the near shore sites, they can just go offshore to the smorgasbord. But no, because the calves need the protection offered at the near shore site. So that was one thing that came out of my paper. And so moms don't have the luxury of going offshore when those drilling platforms really get going. So the recommendation we made from this special issue was just to consider the seasonality of the area and just don't drill in the nearshore sites while the calves are still with mom. Unfortunately, that's the time of the year when the ice is broken up there and it's easiest to extract resources from that area, which is why the whales are there. Okay, so hopefully I was able to convince you, I just have one more slide for you, that like a conservation issue like this, even when you're talking about 170 whales left in an entire potential species here, and all these people that care and all these groups that are interested and motivated, that it was still really, really difficult to get this done. And in fact, now we've moved up to about 220 individuals, so it's looking pretty good. However, there is a war now going on in this area, right? The Russia-Ukraine war. So it's really unclear anymore what's actually happening anymore. All of the scientists have been pulled out of the area. They're not communicating anymore with the US. We don't know what's going on. We're not allowed in there anymore, so we don't know what's going on. It's likely that they have moved forward with drilling. What happened recently is that ExxonMobil pulled out of the area. They said, we don't want to have anything to do with this. So ExxonMobil left the region and they owned 30% of that energy conglomerate that was drilling there. So that's good. It kind of made a statement. And then as like a countermeasure to that, Russia just seized control of that whole project. So got rid of basically all of the user groups there and said, we're in charge now. So it's kind of a very tenuous situation right now. So we don't know what's going on, unfortunately. But I don't want to leave you sad. I want you to leave with an uplifting take-home message, which is that mitigation was starting to work. We finally got all these people to talk to each other and work together, even though that was really difficult. We went from 170 to about 220 individuals in that time of those whales and about 43 reproductive females as of when everyone was kicked out. So I hope that I've convinced you that these whales have shown themselves to be resilient in the past and that they will probably be able to do so again in the future once maybe the turbulence there calms down. We'll see. So I'm hopeful that once this war is over, that we can continue to get people to work together who have very different goals and priorities and values in order to not only help this particular species, but all the ones that we care about. Yeah. Okay. So stay tuned. That's all I have for you right now. This is like hot off the presses kind of stuff right now. So yes. Okay. That's all. And I still have 5 minutes or 4 minutes. Okay.
Then when someone poses a question in this room, would you repeat it to them?
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So what's your research focus going to be until you get back in?
Good question. So actually, I have a couple of different projects going on. So my area of expertise is looking at, from the whales' perspective, the food that they have available to them in that area. And so that was the role I played in that, was quantifying that. I do that for other species as well, whether they're endangered or not. So this just happens to be critically endangered species. So I've continued on with that work with other species. I'm also starting to develop a new program, and I was talking with Nora about it a little bit, actually. I'd like to start looking at some of the land mammals, especially the middle-sized ones that exist in this area and in the GNA. And so I'm actually starting to develop a program maybe there as well. So yeah, just shifting away from gray whales for now, which honestly, this is one thing I left out. The reason it took so long to get this published is because when you're trying to get your research through ExxonMobil editors, it's very, very difficult. They remove a lot from your writing. If it's not just a fact, if you try to wax philosophical and extend this to, a suggestion or a recommendation for conservation, or like, you can only say that. I couldn't even say critically endangered in some places. I had to say endangered or possibly endangered, right? Like it was. So I'm really glad not to be dealing with the politics of this anymore and just being a biologist again for a while. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to repeat your question. You have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Good one. Speaking of politics, my question is, when you're doing research, how often
Such a good question.
Intertwined with, like, what-
That's such a good question. So for the folks at home, the question was basically about the intersection between you as a scientist and a biologist and you as an advocate for your species. It's a really good question. So it's a squishy answer though. What I've learned is if you want to be taken seriously as a scientist, you have to be very careful to not pose yourself as an advocate in your research. You have to be as objective as you can be while still not denying the fact that these animals are impacted in some negative ways by humans. And so there's that. And then there's another part of me that recognizes that someone has to advocate for these species because whatever we're doing is not working, right? There is a mass extinction event happening right now. And so it's getting to a point where it's so critical that you almost want to come out of your ivory tower anyway and just be like, just shout at people and be like, stop doing it, you know? So it's a really good question you're asking. It's one that I struggle with all the time, is those two hats, right? Like I got into this research because I want to help. And then I realized that that could be seen as having an agenda and influence how people see my work. So, mind fuck. Yeah. I knew.
I have a question, maybe. That part. So you mentioned why not different species yet?
Yeah. 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 So the question Manu has is about why are they considered subspecies and not the same species? So the short answer is because we don't know much about the Western gray whale because there's so few of them. In order to understand who's mating with who, right? So if they were the same species, they could mate, right? You would have to be able to track individuals longitudinally over time. And getting a tag to stay on a whale for more than a day is really difficult. So you'd have to be able to connect individuals or genetics or something, right? But the reason why it's controversial is because there was once a tag put on a gray whale, a Western gray whale. And to everyone's surprise, that individual actually did go over to Baja, where the Eastern gray whales go. And whale biologists will argue fiercely that that was an anomaly, that was a one-off, that was a weird individual. And folks who would rather not have limitations put on their activities argue that this is evidence that they may not actually be different. But my way of thinking about it is if someone whose life history is like this mates with someone whose life history is like this, and then that individual offspring is doing some weird combo of the two, that might not be adaptive. They have to kind of pick one. So it depends on the viability of, but we don't know. It's still fiercely debated today. Yeah. Yeah. Some genetics would be cool, but you got to get to Russia. Or maybe Japan.
I read from Brazil, so I'm all right. I'll read from that.
Yeah, totally.
You mentioned that it's,
Yeah, so it's 12:52. I have some questions in the chat that I'll get to. But if anyone has to leave because you have a class to get to or something like that, please don't feel bad. Go ahead and do what you got to do. But I'll stick around for another 5 minutes or so if you have more questions. Okay.
why don't you take this?
All right. Yeah. So I have some questions in the chat. Oh, interesting. So one question I have in the chat is, do you think people would risk their lives to tag an animal even during a conflict or a war? Yeah. So have you guys ever heard of Sea Shepherd? Yeah. So there are conservation groups that start to border on like militant. And I will be honest and say I have mixed feelings. I think there is a place in this world for some people maybe pushing the boundaries of what's considered polite in order to have a message heard. In order to enact change. But that said, I'm not necessarily one of those types. But they will ride up along these whaling ships and throw grenades and whatever. So there are those types of people that would be willing to do this. There are scientists that would be willing to do it too, for sure, because they care. Yeah. And then there's just a lot of general comments in the chat here about just the weirdness that are humans thinking of animals as resources and just that general attitude, as well as, oh, that scientists caring about the species that they study is, you know, how dare we do that? But yeah. Okay. Any other last questions or comments, or just, I mean, I kind of talked at you for a while, but like, I'm happy to hear your thoughts or anything that came up for you guys. Yeah. Okay, Brad has a question.
We know that you have been very involved in the Sustainability Council. That
I
you
was.
paid,
Yeah.
well, you have been and know what the concerns are.
Yeah.
And the climate crisis has been a big part of the work that we've done at West University. And I'm just curious how your sensitivity to those issues interacted with a research agenda or a research project that was funded by a large oil corporation,
Yeah.
whose activities may be impacting the populations you're studying in more than one way, not just from the drilling and the sounds, but from changes to the climate.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question you're asking. My colleagues and I have thought about this a lot and talked about it a lot. On the one hand, you kind of feel like you're taking blood money or something, because you know that these companies are doing the equivalent of greenwashing their activities, or maybe blue washing in this case. But there's another part of you that's like, this is less than 1% of their budget. Want to give us all this money? Fine, we'll take it, and then we can use that to learn things about these animals that we've always wanted to know for a long time, but we haven't had the funding or the logistical support to do it. So you're kind of like making a deal with the devil in a way. But the other thing that was really nice about that was, in the end, it actually ended up moving the ball forward on this conservation issue, because it got these groups talking to each other. And it was actually Roger Melton, that scientist that I showed you. I met him in person, and he's this Texan from Houston, and he's huge, and he has this southern drawl, and he was so serious about this being a real thing. Like, he was like, I know you guys know who I work for, but he said the people that are on the ground on those platforms, for example, when they feel that they're hurting something, when they see a dead whale, they don't want to be responsible for that. They're not making billions of dollars. They don't have dividends, things like that, invested in this company. So like, just the on the ground people and the scientists, they don't want it. So yeah, it's oftentimes to get stuff done, you kind of have to hold your nose and like shake someone's hand. One thing with the papers was we made a deal that while they could redact things that weren't purely factual, that they weren't allowed to change the message or the conclusions or the data or our interpretation. Just some of the more controversial language we had to tone down. Yeah. But yeah, it's hard. I don't like it, but they're the ones with all the money.
And do changes to the climate seem to be impacting populations of whales in ways not connected directly to the research you were doing?
Even the area oceanographically is changing, probably due to climate change. There's already some of that seeming to start to happen out there. And one of the papers in that special issue does address that, or at least touches on it. And also you saw with the eastern gray whales, they were a conservation success story, and climate change just nailed them, right? And it still is. So this western gray whale population, even if, you know, because the Stockholm energy investment, they were starting to change the timing of their drilling. But that's probably not the case anymore. It's just Russia. Not to say Russia's bad, but it's just like, we don't know what's going on. Their priorities are different right now. Yeah, blood money. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jen,
Yeah,
very much
thank
for
you
sharing
everyone
this
who came to my talk, and thanks for your awesome questions and thoughtful comments. All right, thank you guys.